The House Ethics and Oversight Committee will come to order. Would the clerk please take the attendance?
Chair Burns.
Here.
Representatives Hope.
Here.
Breen.
Present.
Churches.
Present.
Hoskins.
Here.
Wagella.
Here.
Kuntz.
Here.
Wozniak.
Here.
Harris.
Here.
Madam Chair, you have 9 members present. You do have a quorum.
Thank you so much. Representative Breen moves to adopt the meeting minutes from our June 8th, 2023 meeting. There being no objection, the motion will prevail by unanimous consent. Welcome everyone to our meeting today. At today's committee meeting, we will have a presentation from our Michigan Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson, who will also be joined by Aaron Shore, the Legislative Policy Director for the Department of State. We also have Agogo Adevier, our Deputy Secretary of State here, so I want to acknowledge and welcome you as well. And following the presentation, members, as always, will have time to ask at least one question. We know that we're kind of running up against session, so we will be mindful of time. But yes, we're excited to have the Secretary and her team here today. So at this time, I would like to invite Secretary Benson to come up and begin your presentation.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Good morning, Chair Burns and members of the House Ethics Committee. I'm pleased to be here with all of you today to talk about these important issues and hear from you about how we can address the reality that for far too long our state has been among, if not the worst state in the nation when it comes to government transparency and ethics laws. And in my view, it's something that provides us with an opportunity to lead the country and show how good government can be run. And it really starts with all of you considering policies that would take us from worst to first and ensure that we have the tools and resources that we need in my office, and that more importantly, the citizens have the tools and resources they need to ensure they are fully informed about the workings of what you all do here in Lansing and how they can both be a part of them, but also ensure that they can hold bad actors accountable. And I think it's very clear voters want these changes. They want changes to our ethics laws. They want government to operate transparently. This was made clear when Proposal 1 was enacted in 2022 that required, as you all know, more transparency at the intersection of money and politics. So I'm here today to really urge you to go above and beyond what the voters required, because Proposal 1 is important and it's a first step, and it's really most relevant in communicating and articulating the view of the voters on these matters. And I hope you can see it as a rallying cry for us to do more to ensure voters have the tools and resources they need to be fully informed and engaged. The good news is there's a whole lot that we can do here in Michigan to get us there and to bring us into becoming a leader in government transparency and ethics laws. Including Proposal 1 and fully implementing that, we believe expanding financial disclosure requirements from just our offices to include candidates for our offices, Supreme Court justices, and other statewide elected officials, such as education and university boards, should be considered. In general, we are not, and I think it's important to remember, we're not going to be pioneers in this regard, because even Congress at the federal level still has disclosure requirements and real penalties for noncompliance, including fines, candidate disqualification, and even prosecution. And so we don't have to look far to see the importance not just of these disclosure requirements and find examples of how to make them real, because the federal government does this and many states already do. But the lesson of the federal government, as they've evolved these disclosure requirements over time, is the importance of enforcement and real penalties for failure to comply. Indeed, all that we could build would risk becoming ineffective if we don't have actual enforcement mechanisms. And we can talk in great deal, both here in committee and elsewhere, about what those enforcement mechanisms would look like. But you have not just one, but 2 state agencies, my agency and the Department of Attorney General, that stand ready to ensure we have fair and equitable enforcement ability of the requirements, the financial disclosure requirements, and otherwise that you might implement and help us implement. In addition to all of that, the second thing that you can enact is, which I think, and I often refer to as low-hanging fruit, because this is not something that is out of the blue, and it's something many other states do, is to close the revolving door from government to lobbying by requiring at least a one-year gap for all legislators and a two-year hold for committee chairs, the Speaker, and the Senate Majority Leader, and to anyone who holds statewide office. We know in a moment, in an era of term limits, as we have here in Michigan, how important it is to ensure that people cannot be promised jobs upon completion of their terms in exchange for legislation or other favors. And so it should be, in my view, this is a layup to enact, because it's something that would send a clear message to citizens that you're there for them and you're working for them, and that you'll close the door on any potential for any of your colleagues to in any ways be influenced unduly by future employers by closing that revolving door. I should mention this is also something that has a great deal of support and approval from the public, as well as journalists who cover your work all throughout the state. The third thing that we recommend is reforming the lobbying legislation to establish that high-level staff are also lobbyable, so that any support they receive from lobbyists is similarly subject to the same disclosure requirements as all of us as elected officials and department heads. That would also close a loophole that, in my view, has been exploited or is exploitable, and again would quite easily just ensure full disclosure of the conversations and the influence that lawmakers are under, and assure citizens that that you are working for them and that they have information that backs that up. When it gets to dark money in politics, we can also ban some practices and shine lights on others. For example, we can ban all gifts above the federal threshold to office holders and their staffs. We can more strictly regulate PACs and super PACs and leadership PACs and social welfare organizations by limiting the number a person can have, and also matching federal contribution and disclosure requirements. In other words, a lot of what we can do on the disclosure side here in this state is already done at the federal level. And so a place to start with a lot of these changes in bringing us up to speed as a state is simply matching what we have at the federal level for folks here in the state. And that would, again, align with the interests and needs of voters. We also must expand our obligations under FOIA to include the governor's office and the state legislature. And finally, in addition to enacting these anti-corruption requirements I've just summarized, again, to reinforce what I said earlier, we must have meaningful enforcement mechanisms in place, because simply requiring disclosure, we found, and the experience of other states and at the federal level shows that those requirements are not enough. We actually have to have, again, not just enforceable consequences, but agencies that are empowered to investigate complaints and follow up with necessary consequences where violations are found. Currently, for example, the Bureau of Elections and the Department of State does not have discovery or subpoena power to investigate any breaches of our campaign finance or lobbying laws. That really hampers our ability to ensure the laws, even those already on the books, are fully enforced and consequences are levied against those who would violate them. In my view, if you give us these abilities at the Bureau of Elections, for example, we can ensure that elected leaders and candidates obey our laws and face penalties when they don't. It also enables us, and I would encourage you to support our efforts to do this, to educate candidates and voters about the requirements, especially if you expand disclosure requirements. We want to make sure, just like we want voters to have all the tools and resources to take advantage of that information and those disclosure requirements, we want to make sure lawmakers and others that fall under those requirements have the tools and resources to comply. Because we've also found in examining violations and seeing examples in other states, yes, there are bad actors. There are individuals who would willingly, intentionally skirt the laws, but there are many who simply just don't realize a certain filing is due or have noncompliance as a reflection of something other than intentional will to not comply. So our job, and what I would see the job of the Bureau of Elections is educating candidates and making sure lawmakers know the ways in which compliance can be met and the consequences that are felt if compliance is not. And I would also say we don't have to look at this necessarily as a laundry list of things that we would want to do or change because, again, a lot of these laws are already in place in other states. And so your challenge and your opportunity is just to simply align what we're doing in Michigan with other states and what voters in other states already enjoy, knowing not only that voters want you to go in this direction as exemplified by Proposal 1, but also that these solutions are tried and tested and proven effective and can be easily modified to fit within our existing legal framework here in Michigan. So I would simply close by saying that there is we often talk about sunshine when we talk about ethics and transparency laws, and the good news is there's a lot of sunshine we can welcome into our state with these changes. We have long been the butt of jokes in Michigan and elsewhere as the fact that we have been at the bottom of the Center for Public Integrity Index and many other indexes because of our lack of government transparency and ethics requirements. And the great news is that we can go from worst to first by simply implementing national best practices that are in place elsewhere and make Michigan a place, in my view, that is a model for good governing, legislating and leading done with integrity, and making sure we're doing this and working to do this in a bipartisan way, because this is something every voter wants, and I think every lawmaker and every official should willingly want to see in our state. So thank you again for inviting me here today. My office will be happy to assist and provide information at any time on the legislation moving forward.
Thank you, Secretary Benson. We really appreciate your comments and your presence here today. So we'll start off with questions. I'll kick us off with one, and then we'll talk to our members as well. So if anybody has a question, just give us a wave. Secretary, I know you talked about policies and then, of course, the need for enforcement, right? We can have all the policies we want on the books, but if we're not actually enforcing anything, it kind of falls by the wayside. What would you say are the most impactful enforcement measures that you've seen, either that you currently have the tools for or that you've seen in other states?
I think there are three enforcement measures that are helpful. One, the ability of the enforcing body to actually gather information, subpoena power, about a complaint, and making sure that whether it's a responsive investigation, responding to a complaint, or a proactive one that is initiated from the office, that there are appropriate mechanisms in place to gather the data and information that is needed to determine whether a violation has occurred. And then secondly, certainly civil penalties, fines, and the like that cannot just be levied but actually collected is important. We know, and we've experienced firsthand in my office, that simply just levying a fine is one step, but we have to make sure we have collection ability as well. And then lastly, I think when there are egregious intentional violations, adding criminal penalties as well, that similarly candidates, I would argue, need to be anyone who would be falling under the potential to risk criminal culpability should also be fully informed about those consequences. So requiring people to, once they become a candidate, read and sign a statement that they're aware of the criminal sanctions or culpability involved if there is a violation would also address the need to ensure people don't inadvertently violate the law and find themselves in trouble from a criminal standpoint.
That makes sense. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Next, we'll go to our Vice Chair, Hope.
Thank you. I'm sure you've answered this question before, but I'd like to ask again just because you're here and we have the benefit of your insight today. There was an obstacle to some of the disclosure and ethics changes in the Senate that's no longer there. And one of the arguments against
Person was the obstacle, not
he who shall not be named. Yes.
Okay, got it. I didn't understand what the obstacle was. Okay,
Voldemort. And one of his responses was, well, if we do that, if we require disclosures and all these ethical compliance things, then we're going to lose good candidates. What would you say to that?
I would say two things. One, what causes good people to not get involved in politics is not the requirement that they disclose things. It's many other requirements, perhaps even some of the more corruptible influences in politics that make people uninterested in participating in what is truly an honor and a great public service. More than that, the examples of other states illustrate that that disclosure requirements do not deter good people from running for office.
Please.
And then, how do you feel about public funding of campaigns?
I think a lot of I'm interested in exploring that further. We've talked to a lot of organizations and citizens who have an interest in that. Certainly, there's in the reformed community a lot of evidence that it does help get the money out of politics to have public funding. But there's also some other complexities to it, including the funding mechanism itself, that have to be sorted out. So I'm interested in conversations that go in that direction and explore it. And I would also say any of those conversations I would welcome, not just among lawmakers, but among maybe perhaps public forum where we can invite citizens to be a part of those conversations as well, and other experts to weigh in on the impact that would have on politics in Michigan. But I think any policy, any reform that data shows would amplify citizens' influence in the policymaking process is a good direction to go in. And that certainly has been shown. Public funding has certainly been shown to amplify and engage citizens more in the governing process, which is a good thing.
Okay. Thank you, Rep. Hope. Vice Chair Kuntz.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And before my question, I would like to wish you a happy birthday.
Oh, so thank you. I appreciate that. I think a lobbying
We gonna sing?
firm may have put out a date that is not entirely accurate.
Oh,
I
well.
appreciate the birthday wishes very much. It looks like I will be having 2 birthdays this year, so thank you so
on
much.
both. One cake, though.
I really appreciate that.
Madam Secretary, thank you for coming today. What would it take to get a declaratory ruling on a 501c4, on the eligibility of those funds? Can you walk me through that process?
Yes, you would simply file a request with our office for a declaratory ruling referencing the law that you'd want to be interpreted in a certain way and any set of facts that could be relevant.
We can do that. We need counsel to do that. A legislator can do that. Is there,
Yes.
We have standing.
I believe so. You could submit a request, or a citizen can request or a declaratory ruling from our office.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Rep. Wagella.
Thank you for being here and the work that you're doing. I have this vision for Michigan where like we have really accessible campaign finance reports and lobbying disclosure. Right now, the system is really tough to navigate as a legislator and I think just as a citizen. So I guess my question is, what can we somehow develop an app where people can look at, look up their person in office, see all their campaign finance, see all their lobbying disclosures. Can your office do that on its own? Would we need to give you funding? And then, while I think you're wonderful, you will not be here forever in this role. So how can we ensure that that stays in the long run? Are there things that we can do as a committee?
I think codifying a lot of the best practices that our office is trying to implement is one way to make sure they continue on. And I would welcome legislative instruction and funding to create any sort of mechanism, an app or otherwise, that would enable us to ensure the relevancy and accessibility of information to citizens. So, so welcome those conversations with your office and others about. And I'm a very sort of data-driven research person. So what is the research? So what are other states doing to solve what I think is the problem at the root of that, which is how can we ensure every citizen has access in a relevant way, in sort of digestible way, to the information that we're requiring to be disclosed, whether it's lobbying information or contributions information or expenditures, and then let's build that. And that does take resources. That does also require the help and support of DTMB oftentimes, but that's, our job as the agency is to implement and make that real. So would love to kind of figure out what would work best, what mechanism would be most palatable, work with the lawmakers to build it and fund it, and then on the other end, work to make sure communities all across the state have access to it and know how to access it.
And can I ask one more very brief question?
Yes.
So on that kind of same note, right now in our primary system with early voting, our campaign finance reports and primaries are due actually after voting begins. One of the things I would hope to see, and I'm curious what your thoughts are, is either adding another report date or moving the report date. And I know, sorry, colleagues, for more reporting potentially. But my point is, I almost feel like that date should happen before voting begins. Has there been any conversation about that?
There hasn't. I'm welcome to, open to having the conversation about those reporting dates. I think, again, it would have to be coupled with, and again, I come at this as the more transparency, the better, and certainly the more information citizens can have going to the voting booth, noting that we now have 9 days of early voting and even more expanded absentee voting options for citizens. So in some ways, the voting process starts even earlier than Election Day itself. In many ways, it just does start now. So we have to keep that in mind as well. But let's look at the data as to, what citizens would most need and in what way it could be delivered, and then help candidates comply with any new requirements as well. And then, frankly, and this is something I've been trying to do since day one of my first term, we need assistance and support and funding to build out a disclosure system that is modernizing MRTS and making it more accessible to candidates. I guess that's a sort of off the top of my head way of saying the more disclosure requirements we implement, which are going to be good for voters and citizens in terms of transparency, must be coupled with more effective and ease of reporting for candidates themselves, because we don't want reporting to deter people from running or get people tangled up in requirements that they don't intend to violate, but then inadvertently do, creating more problems for many people to run for office if they're not independently wealthy and the like. So, long way of saying, let's have that discussion. I think anything that moves us in the direction of transparency is great, and let's figure out the best way to get there, and also the best way to ensure our reporting system is one that is fully accessible and modernized for everyone.
Thank you. Rep. Breen?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And actually, that I have two questions, if that's okay, but it builds on what my colleague just requested. We've seen some systemic failures, particularly with the unemployment system. So I was wondering, with all these things that people want to do in the spirit of transparency and having an open democracy, MRT seems to be a really cumbersome issue for a lot of people. I don't do it. I don't touch it. I want nothing to do with it. That's why most people hire a professional bookkeeper or treasurer. Are there any plans in the works to update MRT, maybe set it on fire or get something new?
Yes, there are.
Going on
And we're not going to set it on fire. Noted. I appreciate the suggestion. But yeah, I mean, again, we've been looking at the contract that the state has with this entity and trying to find other ways of creating this system. Funding has always been an issue because we'd have to recreate something. And so we're hopeful that the budget process, maybe this year with the additional capacity that we need to implement Proposal 1, that provides us with an opportunity to re-examine that. But it is a high priority for us to modernize our system of reporting in the state.
Okay. Madam Chair, my next question.
Yes.
There's been some discussion amongst the clerks about the amount of time between the primary and the general. And I'm wondering, how much of a priority is it, or how necessary do you think it is to move the primary, which is currently in August, to an earlier date, if it needs to be moved at all?
Yeah, I think moving the primary date in the midst of the cycle where we currently are creates additional problems that are unrelated to the very real problems that we need to solve in the intersection of the current primary and general election dates, early voting, no reason absentee voting, UACAVA and overseas voters requirements and all the like. So I do think we have to have that discussion. And I think it has to be a discussion that involves a lot of stakeholders because it impacts a lot of stakeholders. And I would encourage that discussion to be focused on not changing anything for the cycle we're already in, which is 24, and look to having that discussion because it's an important one, and perhaps making those changes as the collaborative legislative process goes forward, with an eye towards the 26 or future election cycles, where implementing any changes would be much more. I don't want to say easier, but would be much more smoother because, again, you have candidates who are currently collecting signatures and doing other things on the current calendar, and you have clerks already preparing under the current calendar. So any changes to the current calendar for the 24 cycle, as well-intentioned, as important as they may be, will create other problems for others, candidates included in this cycle, those problems wouldn't necessarily be created in future cycles because you have the benefit of time and notice and clarity.
I'm just wondering, what kind of a time frame would you be thinking? June, July?
I mean, I think the consensus that of the conversations that have been held so far is June. I think there's more conversations that need to happen, and I really defer to the work that Chair Cerniglu and the Elections Committee are doing to bring those stakeholders together. And we've been there as subject matter experts to help folks understand in those discussions what different implications of different changes would mean. But the biggest thing I think is we need to be providing clarity for individuals who are on the who are going to be in some way a part of the 2024 election cycle as soon as possible. And a lot of these changes are important conversations to have, and certainly many have spoken up about them. And I would offer, and as I have said this, that if you look at implementing those changes in the 26 election cycle or into the future, that alleviates a lot of the concerns many would have about making those changes in 24. The specific dates and all the rest, I think, again, bring individuals together and collaborate around, because a lot of people beyond just our office is impacted by these decisions, and so we need to have all of those individuals and voices at the table. And I think through that you'll develop the consensus approach. And I think the time that would be given by saying we're going to implement this in a future election cycle, not this one, would enable a more collaborative discussion that'll come up with the best possible solution.
Thank you. Rep. Churches?
Thank you so much. This just, it gets me thinking about a lot of things. So I sit before you as a former fifth grade teacher of 10 years, and this job has been, like, looking back at my experience being a candidate, it was one of the most inaccessible things that I've ever tried to do. I was a teacher. I had no political experience whatsoever, and I wanted to make a change. So I ran for this seat, and I ran against a man who had run against the current senator that represents my district. He was a city council person, a business owner, independently wealthy, connections with the party. He had less than 300 donors to his campaign. I had just under 8,000. It is a feat to be able to run a campaign, right? But I had to work at it. And I was willing to do that. I had to make a lot of personal sacrifices, as many of us do. And then my biggest problem, I think, in this occupation is I never want to lose the piece of myself about why I wanted to do this. And the amount of influence that I've encountered in this occupation is I have to constantly check myself to make sure that I'm staying true to who I am. And I don't think our system right now currently reflects checks and balances with what it is like to be a human who experiences these interactions that are not typical. Because as a fifth grade teacher, I mean, I got Target gift cards or Starbucks gift cards maybe at Christmas time or at the end of the year. It was like $15, $20 gift cards. Very sweet. But usually I'm more motivated by the hug when the kid understands how to do long division with decimals and they finally got it after a week of working on it. But in this environment, something that we don't talk about, and I even feel uncomfortable saying it now, but like being offered to go to a suite, to go see a concert, a Taylor Swift concert, or to have a dinner. I feel uncomfortable having dinner with folks that I don't really know, but I know it's like a business transaction, and maybe I'm unfamiliar because I'm not in the business community. I come from the education community. So these things are not typical of the occupation I came from before, and it doesn't seem like there's limits on them. So it seems like you're trying to make this more accessible for everyday working people to have and hold these positions, which I greatly appreciate. But do you think, first, I just wonder your opinion, because I've straight up asked stakeholders the money that they contribute to our campaigns. Do you think that this influences people? And I've been told no, which I feel like that's a disingenuous answer, because everything impacts everything. Everything has an impact on us. From if you smile someone, if you look at someone, the way you greet someone can set the tone. So I don't understand how giving a certain amount of money doesn't impact someone. So by saying no, maybe you say the right thing, but does that mean anything? So I wonder, how are we going to ensure that the checks and balances with contribution amounts and gifts giving is appropriate and supportive to ensure that me and the people that sit in these seats and have this honorable job are able to stay true to our constituents.
Well, I'll say, Rep. Churches, you already have everything you need to stay true to the will of your voters and your constituents and represent your district well. You already are doing it. You already have it. You don't need anyone else's influence or assistance to get there. And so remember that. You're already the person that people sent here to do their work on their behalf. And you don't need to change anything to become that person. You already are. And I think related to that, looking to other states about how they provide more transparency of influence and then deter undue influence is a pathway to getting started. And I think we're at a point right now as a state where we're low. Most states have and the federal government have a lot more requirements than we all do. So we can start by replicating those requirements, and that's what I've outlined today. Once we get there and work on effectively implementing them and educating both lawmakers and citizens alike about them, then we can have sort of the next iteration of that discussion of what additional ethics policies look like. Because I think the end goal is to make sure every single person here, every single one of you represent a community of people who've sent you here to do their work. And that is the work that must always be front and center on your agenda. And we all have a responsibility to build a system that rewards that and doesn't deter that.
Thank you. Rep. Hoskins?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Madam Secretary, for coming in and doing this presentation and answering our questions. I had two things. One was I just want to add to the chorus of burn Mertz, and particularly when I think about my colleague Rep. Churches, who had 8,000 donations that she had to put in. I'm assuming not her personally, but if she personally had to put in those donations, the amount of time it would take for somebody to do that, and the issue. I mean, I can go on and on about the issues with Mertz, and you clearly, this isn't the first time you've heard it, but I just want to, if any resources that we here in the legislature can give to help with the process of transitioning to something better, I think that will really help with compliance, with people who are running for office. If you don't know, if you've never run for office and you've never had to do your campaign finance report, and you get to Mertz where you can't copy and paste, you can't use a Mac, you can't use your phone, it could be jarring, especially if you're, like most people, are last minute. You're right before the deadline, and you're like, oh, okay, I got it in my Excel spreadsheet, I'm good. And then you realize you have to copy everything over. So that's my one thing. My other thing is, as we're talking about the process, really from beginning to end, one of the issues that has come up often, and it certainly is something I've worked on during my time as when I was on legislative staff here, is petition circulators and how they often tend to lie to get people to sign their petitions. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or suggestions on ways that we can kind of curb that activity here in the state.
I have proposed, and I believe and hope we'll see some movement on banning intentional deceptive practices every aspect in the elections process, including lying to people about what they're signing. It should be a basic thing, and there are penalties. Some penalties already in place for that fraud, but it needs to be more explicitly banned in our laws that you can't that there's no place for fraud in our petition process, whether it's collecting signatures for ballot initiatives and lying about what those or misrepresenting about what those are about, or for candidates. So what we've seen over the last cycle, I think, really underscores the need for reform in that area, and reform that really gets at the offenders, which are often not the candidates. They are the ecosystem that is built oftentimes around candidates that takes advantage of systems and oftentimes misrepresents what they're doing, and that's another form of fraud. So, our office is working with the Attorney General's office on seeking culpability for past offenders of fraud in the petition process. But I think it's also illuminated that we need more. We need to do more to ban fraud in the petition process, and would welcome legislation or more discussion around policies that would make that clear.
I would be happy to work with you on
Great.
that.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you. Rep. Wozniak?
Thank you, Madam Secretary, for being here, and thanks for the maize and blue plates. They're great.
I appreciate that. That's not the reason that we brought them back.
Okay, yellow
And we
and
will
blue.
soon be addressing any inequity that people of another university feel around that. So stay tuned. But the Winter Wonderland plate is something that has been very popular with our citizens. So thanks.
So my question is, with the expansion of absentee voting, the position that drop boxes have in that process and the confidence that the voter has, what can you do to expand the confidence? Is it more monitoring, or making sure that the votes that go in there are the same ones that come out?
Yeah. The monitoring we have, I think, helps do that. What we need is to better educate citizens about where to see and how to have confidence that monitoring is happening, and that only that whatever comes out of the drop boxes goes through an additional validation process to ensure they are either legitimate and accurate requests from eligible voters for absentee ballots, or legitimate voters submitting a legitimate ballot for counting. So there are a number of security checks that happen both before and after the Dropbox process, and the Dropbox itself also. And this is something we've been working on with the current laws that I think have gone through the House and the Senate that have required and continue to require not just that monitoring, but chain of custody and other requirements to ensure the integrity of the process. But educating voters about the existing protections already in place is something we want to do more of in districts all throughout the state.
Okay, thank you. Rep. Harris.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and again, thank you, Madam Secretary, for being here. We appreciate your presence. So you've talked a little bit about transparency, and I appreciate that, and that's something I think we're all passionate about. And I know I keep beating a dead horse, but there's been a package that has been submitted on FOIA and sunshine provisions, and we're just not seeing movement. And it's now June. And I think we all know here that the wheels of government move slowly sometimes. And so there's concern about getting these things out in the forefront, whether it's through work groups, whatever, to actually get some work done to make sure that we satisfy the proposal that the voters passed. Do you have any input on that? Are you seeing any work being done on your end?
I would just say I fully support the swift enactment of the expansion of FOIA to cover all branches of government. Well, I should say the executive branch and the legislative branch, to clarify that. But that said, we continue to support any and all conversations that move in that direction. As you know, my office doesn't determine the calendar of things, but we do support the expansion of those laws and have for some time now. I'm confident that the budget process has also gone forward in a way that would help us, I hope, ultimately enforce any requirements that are in place or support the compliance with any additional requirements that are added under the law.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative. All right, so I think we are at the end of our questions from the committee. Madam Secretary, we just want to thank you again for being here with us today. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and your expertise. We will release you because I'm sure you have a very busy day, but thank you again, and we look forward to having you back in the future.
Thanks. This has been very productive. I appreciate all the input, and I look forward to the conversations ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I do want to acknowledge, just as we're wrapping up, this will be our last committee meeting before our in-district work period over the summer months. So I do want to just thank all our committee members for their great work and just attention to detail thus far. And we'll continue to have some conversations over the summer and be ready to do some exciting things and I think make some positive waves when we get back in the fall. So I just want to thank everyone again for their participation and being really great committee members. And at this time, with there being no further business before the committee will stand adjourned.